Jim McNeely, it's a pleasure to present you on Cutting Edge Concerts New Music Festival, and I'm very excited about your piece, which is inspired by the work of Paul Klee.
Right.
And tell us a bit about your relationship with Klee, and of course the fact that he was somebody who was a musician himself.
Yes, I was commissioned to write an album's worth of material based on paintings of Paul Klee by the Swiss Jazz Orchestra. This was in about 2005. Georges Robert was the head of the band, and he contacted me and he said, "We'd like you to write some pieces based on his paintings." And I leapt at the chance because Paul Klee had been somebody I'd been very interested in since I had been a kid. When I was a teenager, I got interested in modern art mainly through it was the cover of the Dave Brubeck album Time Out, and that was a Joan Moreau painting, and that got me into checking out all these contemporary post-war artists, and Paul Klee was certainly one of them, although he was also very active before the war. He had a very childlike aspect to some of his work, and there were also treble clefs and musical notes and these little motives that would come up from time to time in his work. It just spoke to me as a musician. So when I started to research him for this project, I found out, yes, he was an amateur musician himself. He was a violinist. In fact, when he was around 20 years old, he had to make a choice between being a professional violinist or a professional visual artist, and he chose the visual arts. He thought that, and this was probably around the early 20s, that music was kind of finished in his mind, that he'd end up, he loved Bach and Mozart, but he'd be playing music that was written by people sometime before, whereas he thought the visual arts had more of a future. So he got into that. So I started to research him, and there was something about him and his life and his musical work that really resonated with me, and his imagery, and so then I really dove into the project. It was great.
And one of the images is the tightrope walker.
Right.
Can you tell us a little about your piece?
Yeah, it's some of Klee's work has very fine line work. It's very finely drawn, and this is one of them. It's a little guy up on the tightrope, and he's got a big, one of those big stick, whatever kind of those
to balance,
things. Yeah,
right?
To balance bar. That's right. And we don't see where anything is mounted. It looks like it's up in the clouds somewhere, and my God, it must be, might be a couple of miles down to the ground. And but he's up there, and he's very delicate. The whole painting is very delicate, and so I just had this image of this tightrope walker kind of gingerly walking out and kind of retracting and coming back out, and trying to keep his balance in the piece. And so I tried to also keep the more delicate nature of the painting in mind too.
And as far as the musical interpretation, it's a concerto, isn't it? Really, a soloist with the ensemble.
Well, actually, that's the other one, Death and Fire. That's the Tightrope Walker. I'm always thinking that the German title is Der Seiltanzer, and I still call it that. Tightrope Walker is a solo for myself on the piano and bass.
I see.
The other piece, Death and Fire, Tod und Feuer, it's a very ghostly kind of image that he created on the canvas. And in fact, it's not a canvas. I think it's a linen, piece of linen that he painted on oftentimes. And that's kind of I thought of that as a kind of a tone poem that features the alto saxophone throughout. And so the piece starts in a very dark kind of way, and in the painting you see that it's this ghostly image, and over in the left corner there's a warm glow. That's the fire. And so I kept thinking of just somebody being drawn to the fire, so the energy increases and the tempo increases and builds up to a certain point.
Now you have you work with orchestras, jazz orchestras all over the world, and in Europe as well. Are you with the Frankfurt Radio Orchestra?
Right, I'm chief conductor with the Frankfurt Radio Big Band.
Right.
It's a very good band. Yeah.
Right, and I wanted to ask you about jazz musicians in Germany, and also in Switzerland, of course, and in America, some of the, perhaps some of the differences.
Well, there are a lot of similarities, especially in the last 20, 25 years, there have been great strides in jazz education over in Europe. Didn't used to be that way, say, in the early 80s, but now certainly there are jazz schools. The one in Bern, Switzerland, there's one in Cologne, Germany, Mannheim, Germany. A lot of places are producing a lot of young, really good jazz musicians. Not only soloists on things like saxophone and trumpet, but also drummers and bass players and piano players. The old saw used to be that 30 years ago you'd go to Europe and there'd be some great soloists, but there were no rhythm sections. But that's not the case anymore. There's some really, really good young players. And in the Frankfurt Radio Band, there are a number of really good players that they could hold their own over here in the U.S. for sure if they decided to. If they went crazy and decided to come over here.
Well, because music is so respected in Germany.
Yeah.
The budget certainly is vastly different than America.
Yeah, the bands, there are 3 radio bands in Germany that they are subsidized by usually the state governments, or the radio companies are, at least. And so they're full-time bands. They work maybe 40 weeks of the year and 46 weeks of the year, doing a lot of interesting projects. And the one I work with in Frankfurt, they're full-time players. They work from August to the end of June.
Just like here, right?
Yeah, right. And they do a lot of there used to be a lot of radio bands, but a lot of them have died out. The ones that have survived, I think, have realized we have to have an artistic reason to survive. We can't just play dance parties and play with singers, because you play CDs now. We don't need a live band for that. So the big bands that have survived have kind of an artistic mission to commission original music and get interesting projects with soloists from both the U.S. and from Europe. So I really enjoy the work there.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And in this country, you're also very much involved with broadcast music, BMI,
right,
and the Jazz Workshop.
The Jazz Composers Workshop at BMI, and we have 25 students in there. We call them members, and the idea is that they're post-student. They're not in school anymore, and so those are really interesting young jazz composers writing for big band, and then I'm also still involved with the Vanguard Jazz Orchestra that plays still every Monday night, like they have for 45 years, I believe, at the Village Vanguard. Right.
Now, big band used to be the pop music in America in the 40s.
Sure.
And is it making a resurgence?
Well, the term big band, some people hesitate using it because it has a certain meaning to a lot of people. I love that, even my neighbors, I love the big band sound, and they're thinking about Glenn Miller or something like that. And sometimes people prefer the term jazz orchestra. In fact, Duke Ellington, it was always Duke Ellington and his orchestra. We didn't have jazz in the name, just the Count Basie Orchestra. And so the big band situation now is, I think, very well and alive, not only in New York, but all over the U.S. and in a lot of other places. I just got back from Australia, played with a great big band in Sydney and another one in Perth. And so there are these crazy people who put these bands together, and they get people to write for them, and they play interesting music. But it's a little different kind of music than the big bands.
But those big bands really weren't they the sort of the gestating for so many great soloists?
Oh, sure, yeah. Back in the day, people who we regard now as great jazz solos, like Lester Young or Charlie Parker, they all played with big bands from time to time. Lester Young played with Count Basie. Charlie Parker played with Billy Eckstine's big band. So, number one, that was a job. You could earn somewhat of a living doing that. And it also, if you were a soloist with that band, you got a reputation, and then you'd go out on your own. And,
start your own band.
Yeah, so, the big bands before the war were a great, like I said, it's a place where people started their careers. And even after World War II, I remember as a kid. Now I'm a certain age, and but I remember certainly Frank Sinatra records with the arrangements by Billy May or Nelson Riddle, and that was just swinging big band music. And so back in the 50s, that was in the air. It was still, you'd turn on the radio and that's what you would hear is pop music. Yeah.
And the Village Vanguard, is it a jazz orchestra? Or
it's the Vanguard Jazz Orchestra.
Jazz Orchestra, okay.
It's a big band.
Uh-huh.
But, and the music is, I would say half of it is rooted in the music of its co-founder, Thad Jones.
Oh, yes.
Who's still one of my idols. And then the other half is music written by myself or Bob Brookmeyer or a few other composer arrangers over the years. So it's got one foot in the Thad Jones tradition and then one foot in kind of this other tradition that's moving forward. And once in a while we take a step forward into the next phase for the band.
Great. Well, thank you so much for talking with us today.
My pleasure.
And we're looking forward to hearing your music.
Great. I'm looking forward to the concert.
Thank you.
All right. You're welcome.